The internet had a plan. A simple one, really. Take a 3-year-old clip from a college basketball game, attach it to one emotionally raw pre-draft interview, flood every timeline with hot takes about locker room toxicity and manufactured rivalry, and watch the Indiana Fever crack before the season even started. The haters had one job: turn Raven Johnson into Caitlyn Clark's enemy. And for a while, it looked like they might actually pull it off. They had the clip. They had the quote. They had a fan base nervous enough to believe it. What they didn't have was access to the actual locker room, an actual source, or any real understanding of who these two players are when the cameras aren't pointed at them. And the moment Johnson sat down in front of reporters after Indiana's preseason game against Nigeria, the entire constructed narrative collapsed in real time. She called Clark the GOAT. She called her a mentor. She said that the moment she put on a Fever jersey, she told herself they were going to win a championship together. 1 month of practices, 3 preseason games. That's all it took for the most viral rivalry story of the 2026 WNBA offseason to turn into one of the most genuine teammate stories the league has produced in years. Here's how it actually happened, and why the people who tried to write a different ending never had a chance. Let's go back to the 2023 NCAA Final Four. Iowa versus South Carolina. Raven Johnson has the ball up top, surveying the defense, trying to create something for her team. Caitlyn Clark is right there on the perimeter, supposedly responsible for guarding her. Clark reads the matchup in about half a second, decides Johnson isn't a shooting threat at that moment, and waves her off. Not aggressively, not with any malice. Just a cold, calculated dismissal that only players with an almost frightening level of confidence can pull off without it looking forced. The clip spread everywhere because of what it looked like. It looked like one player deciding another player simply didn't matter enough to guard. And in the context of an NCAA Final Four game, with everything those two programs had at stake, that visual landed hard. Johnson didn't forget it. She carried it through the rest of her college career, through South Carolina's redemption arc against Iowa in the 2024 National Championship, and all the way into a pre-draft interview 2 weeks before Indiana selected her 10th overall in the 2026 WNBA draft. She sat in front of that camera and said it out loud. Clark broke her with that wave-off. It embarrassed her. It damaged her confidence so badly that she actually considered walking away from basketball entirely during that stretch. And then, in the same interview, she mentioned the social media pile-on that followed, the harassment, the names she was called, the darkness she retreated into. She said she wanted to quit. She said she wanted to disappear into isolation and just be by herself. That is not a throwaway comment. That is a player describing one of the hardest periods of her life and naming a specific moment and a specific person as the starting point. And she did it right before that same person became her teammate. Once the draft happened and that pre-draft interview started circulating again, 3 distinct narratives took off. None of them had reporting behind them. Not one source. Not one quote from inside the Fever facility. But all 3 were pointing at the same target, and all 3 were designed to do the same thing. The first was the simplest. Clark and Johnson hated each other. The wave-off clip kept getting reposted. Johnson's "broke me" quote kept getting screenshotted. And people with zero access to the Fever facility were presenting all of it as confirmed locker room tension. Not rumored tension, not possible tension. Confirmed, ongoing, already poisoning the roster before training camp even opened. Nobody had a source because nobody needed one. A 3-year-old college clip and 1 pre-draft interview were getting stretched into a story about a franchise already coming apart at the seams. The second narrative was sneakier because it didn't require any specific evidence to gain traction. Clark was toxic in the locker room, and the wave-off was the proof of that, even though it happened in a college game 3 years before Johnson ever put on a Fever jersey. All this narrative needed was for people to accept the idea that a competitor as fierce and as intense as Clark must be difficult to play with. Once you accept that premise, you start reading everything through that lens. Every competitive moment becomes evidence of toxicity. Every intense practice clip becomes confirmation of what the narrative already told you to believe. The third narrative was the most absurd and somehow the most viral. Johnson was better than Clark right now, so Clark should be coming off the bench while Johnson started. People pushed this with straight faces, using Johnson's defensive instincts and energy as the justification. And if you spent more than 10 seconds actually thinking about it, you could see exactly what it was really about, because it had nothing to do with basketball evaluation. None of these three narratives were journalism. They were a script written by people who wanted a specific story and were willing to manufacture the details that would make it believable. Here's what's actually worth getting angry about. Johnson got caught in that crossfire in a way that was genuinely unfair to her, and it had nothing to do with any tension between her and Clark. Johnson is a real basketball player, a legitimate defensive force, a high-energy guard who came out of one of the best programs in college basketball with championship experience and genuine instincts at the point of attack. She was selected 10th overall because of what she actually does on a basketball court. Her ability to pressure the ball, generate deflections, pick up 94 feet every possession, and make opposing guards miserable is exactly what she'd been doing throughout her time at South Carolina under Dawn Staley. All of that was getting buried under a grudge story. Her actual basketball ability, the things that earned her a top 10 pick, barely came up in any conversation because the emotional narrative was louder and easier to click on. The people pushing the rivalry angle didn't care about what Johnson could do defensively or how her game complemented Clark's. They cared about the drama, and in chasing it, they flattened a real basketball player into a character in someone else's story. When training camp opened, the people pushing these narratives were watching and waiting for the explosion they were certain was coming. Johnson walked into the Fever facility and did something that completely blindsided everyone who had already written the script. She asked Clark for help. Think about what that actually required. Johnson had gone on camera weeks earlier and told the world that Clark broke her. And now she had to walk up to that same person every single morning and say, "I don't understand this read, can you walk me through it?" The WNBA game moves differently than college basketball. The terminology is different, the ball screen reads are different. The pace, the spacing, the decision-making windows are all compressed in ways that college basketball simply doesn't prepare young point guards for, and Johnson ran into all of that almost immediately. The person on that roster who understood those concepts better than anyone else was Clark, so that's who Johnson went to. Clark's response told you everything you needed to know. She didn't make it weird. She didn't hold the pre-draft interview over Johnson's head. She didn't treat the questions like a burden or an interruption. Clark walked Johnson through the reads, stayed late to work through concepts, and answered everything Johnson brought to her. Clark talked about it in front of reporters without being asked, saying Johnson asks a lot of really great questions, and adding that, as a point guard, it's a whole other load to carry, which was Clark acknowledging out loud that she understood exactly what Johnson was going through and took it seriously enough to actually help. The respect in that exchange ran both directions. Johnson had to consciously decide to put 2023 down. That's not automatic for a 22-year-old, especially one who had gone on camera and publicly attached her name to those feelings just weeks before. The easier path would have been to stay guarded, keep some distance, let the pre-draft interview quietly define the relationship from a safe remove. Johnson didn't do that. She put the past down and focused on getting better. And Clark met her there every single time.
The preseason game against Nigeria was supposed to be a low-stakes tune-up. Get some reps, stay healthy, and move on. But before it even tipped off, something happened on that court that stopped people mid-scroll. Aaliyah Boston had been out since an injury at Unrivaled earlier in the year, and this was the first time she and Clark had shared a court since July of 2025, almost a full year apart. Before the game started, Clark walked up to Boston and ran their pregame ritual telling her, "You're going to be amazing because you're amazing." The way both of them responded to that exchange told you more about what this team means to these two players than any press conference ever could. Boston's return mattered beyond the emotional piece, though. She is the player who makes Clark's offense operate differently. The inverted pick-and-roll wrinkles that Stephanie White has built around those two create reads that defenses genuinely struggle to stop. Clark played 12 minutes and scored efficiently, distributed the ball, and operated at a pace that looked sharper than where she was at the same point last season. White's offense is giving her cleaner looks because the ball movement and the spacing are actually working the way they're designed to. Kelsey Mitchell scored in ways that somehow always look accidental, until you watch the footage back and realize how deliberate every move actually was. Sophie Cunningham brought the physical edge that makes Indiana's second unit genuinely difficult to play against. And then there was Darius Dantes, who nobody had circled on the Nigeria preview. Dantes had struggled badly through all of 2025, and at several points it genuinely looked like her shooting touch had abandoned her for good. Against Nigeria, she went 4 for 6 from 3. Suddenly, every Fever fan was asking the same question at the same time. Is her shot actually back? Because if it is, Indiana now has a stretch big who can punish defenses that collapse on Clark and Boston in the paint, and that changes the offensive math for every team trying to take away Indiana's two primary options. Johnson also got time on that court, and used every minute of it exactly the way she'd been using every practice rep. She pressured the ball, generated steals, and made it uncomfortable for anyone trying to bring it up against her. Stephanie White called out her defensive presence specifically after the game. 5 steals, 5 assists. The energy she'd been bringing in practice was translating directly to game situations. And then Johnson sat down in front of reporters and said it. She called Clark the GOAT, not buried at the end of a longer answer, not in some vague, diplomatic way that could be interpreted in multiple directions. She called Clark her mentor, said Clark took her under her wing as a professional, and then told the room that when she put the Indiana Fever jersey on, she said to herself, "Let's try to win a championship together." Think about the distance between "she broke me" and "she's the GOAT and my mentor." That is not a PR pivot. A PR pivot is deliberately vague. It smooths things over without actually committing to anything. What Johnson did in that press conference was specific. She named what Clark did for her. She named what Clark gave her. She explained exactly how Clark treated her from the very first day, which means she lived it, and then described it clearly and without hesitation in front of reporters who were waiting for something far more complicated. Johnson also talked about Clark beyond the basketball. She called her funny. She said Clark has so much personality outside of the game that people don't get to see. She talked about the sense of humor, about how Clark can make her laugh and how they vibe together in ways she didn't expect. She said she loves being there with her. That's not a player reciting talking points. That's a 22-year-old rookie describing a relationship that actually exists. Clark had been matching that energy in every media session throughout camp and the preseason, talking about how much she genuinely enjoyed playing with Johnson, calling her questions good ones, saying she wanted her to succeed. The consistency between what both players kept saying publicly, without coordinating their answers, is the clearest signal that none of this was manufactured. They were both describing the same experience because they'd both been living it. The Clark-Johnson pairing isn't just a good story. It's a real problem for opposing teams, and the basketball logic of it was always there for anyone willing to look past the drama. Clark draws so much defensive attention that she needs a guard beside her who can defend on the ball and make opposing guards genuinely uncomfortable. Johnson is exactly that player. Her ability to pick up 94 feet every possession, pressure ball handlers all the way up the court, and generate deflections in the open court gives Clark room to operate as a playmaker without carrying the full defensive burden in the backcourt. Johnson can also play on and off the ball, which gives Stephanie White options across a 44-game regular season that Indiana simply didn't have before. Their styles don't compete with each other. They solve each other's problems. What the haters framed as a conflict was actually a complementary pairing that Clark appears to have recognized immediately. Behind those two, you still have Mitchell, Cunningham, a bench that can actually score, and now Dantes potentially stretching the floor in ways she hasn't been able to in over a year. The people who spent months trying to turn Johnson into Clark's enemy accidentally made this moment land about 10 times harder than it would have if they'd never started. If the rivalry narrative had never been constructed and pushed, Johnson calling Clark the GOAT would have been a nice quote from a rookie about her veteran teammate. Because they spent months screaming about locker room explosions, toxicity, and grudges that were going to destroy the franchise, Johnson walking up to a microphone and saying, "Let's try to win a championship together," hit like a door slamming shut on everything they'd built. Here's what the haters needed. They needed Clark to be a villain and Johnson to be a victim. They needed the wave off to be the beginning of an ongoing story about arrogance and toxicity and a locker room that couldn't survive the personalities inside it. They needed Johnson to carry that resentment into Indiana's facility and let it quietly poison everything. What they got instead was Clark taking a rookie under her wing from day one, answering every question, staying late to work through the concepts, talking a young guard up in front of reporters without being asked. And they got that rookie going on camera to call her the GOAT. None of that happened by accident. It happened because Johnson made a deliberate choice to put the past down and walk through that door with her focus on what mattered. And it happened because Clark met her there without making it a bigger moment than it needed to be, which is honestly its own kind of character evidence. The Fever opened the regular season against the Dallas Wings on May 9th with Clark and Boston back and healthy Mitchell scoring from everywhere, and a backcourt pairing in Clark and Johnson that opposing teams genuinely have no tape on yet. Stephanie White's staff has been talking about Johnson's defensive energy since the first day of camp, and White herself specifically called it out after the Nigeria game. That is not nothing. That is a coaching staff telling you exactly who they trust and why. What do you think of Caitlyn and Raven as teammates? Because the people who were certain this was going to be a disaster owe both of them an apology, and the opening night buzzer on May 9th is going to be very loud. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss when we cover the Fever next.